The operational phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, has been launched with 27 countries as signatories thus far. The AfCFTA will be governed by 5 operational instruments, in other words, the rules of origin, the online negotiating forum, the monitoring and elimination of non-tariff barriers, a digital payment system, and the African Trade Observatory. The AU's largest trade bank, Afreximbank, has unveiled a $1 billion financing facility. It will enable countries to adjust to an orderly manner to sudden tariff revenue losses as a result of the implementation of the agreement. Tonight on African Perspective, we focus on various themes of this, including its proposed benefits. Whom will it benefit? What happens to regional economic communities? And how does the AfCFTA function along existing agreements? Joining us now to discuss this, Catherine Grant Makokera, Director at Tutwa Consulting Group. On my left, Lebohang, Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective and Political Economist on my right. Very good evening to you both, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps let me start with you, Ms. Pheko. Looking at the promised agreement, some say perhaps it's promising a bit too much in terms of the benefits of what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is proposing. What do you think are most realizable in the short term? Let's start with that.
It's hard to say because there hasn't been a short-term view on African regional trade. This conversation has been in the pipe since Abuja, the Abuja Treaty, 1991. So I think the attempt to try and microwave this into compressed bite-sized 1, 2, 3, 4 segments has probably been quite inimical to a deep fundamental understanding of the complexities of trying to aggregate very different asymmetric economies across the continent. I mean, Lesotho is not DRC, Rwanda is not Nigeria, and so on and so forth. And also sometimes often with very different interests, national sovereign interests and so forth. So in the short term, if we can at least have a more open and transparent conversation about what these national interests are, how those link into regional economic interests, then we can begin to build these building blocks more effectively.
That lack of agreement on the big and larger picture, is it possibly why we've seen Nigeria hold back somewhat on being a signatory and having even more countries endorse this?
I mean, national interests, national sovereignty, you know, economic nationalism, all the things that I think, you know, are very difficult when you're trying to build a building block which is advertised as having equal benefits to all parties. They cannot be equal benefits to all parties because not all parties operate in an equal environment. They don't have the same social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, different currency values, and
I suppose that the same dividend rate when it comes to the individual markets, Catherine. But when we talk about jobs, which is the biggest thing that Africans are looking towards, is that something that will be as realizable as is being projected out there? Something like a GDP growth of 35% in the next couple of years that will lead to jobs.
I mean, I do think that the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement are overstated by most studies. I think it makes a lot of assumptions when you hear those figures about the dramatic increases in growth and the sudden increases in trade amongst African countries that is supposed to come about after the agreement comes into force. And the assumption about how it will impact on jobs requires you to really think about the linkages between what a trade agreement, which is a legal document, it's a legal construct really, negotiated by government officials. For it to become real for anybody else, it needs to be implemented. And this, of course, has always been the stumbling block for many of these other attempted grand regional integration initiatives on the African continent, is we're good at putting things on paper and making the agreements themselves look quite nice, quite sophisticated, quite appealing to economists who model the impact. But then you have to implement, especially if you want to see any trickle down to jobs. That said, I do believe that exporting firms, and certainly the data shows this, are more likely to create jobs than firms that remain just constrained to their domestic markets. That can be a challenge, however, depending on the particular firms involved in trade and whether they can in fact be competitive in other markets. So there's a whole lot of issues that would need to be resolved before we would safely say that this thing will create more jobs.
I mean, Ms. Pheko, some of the projections point to a significant reduction in poverty, especially in various countries. And I'm wondering if some of the infrastructure that's already in place to allow people to trade within Africa, why has that not led to such benefits? Why have we not seen at least meaningful enough socio-economic change within the existing partnerships? And we'll come to those regional economic communities in just a moment.
So especially because there are already several preferential trade agreements within our existing RECs, SADC, COMESA, the East African Community, ECOWAS, and so on and so forth, the Maghreb region in North Africa, and so forth. So one would have thought that those would already have had some kind of an impetus towards much more aligned and much more streamlined economic benefits across and within countries and regions. And secondly, the multiple poles of regional economic communities. So several countries already belong to multiple RECs, which is quite difficult. I mean, at least 4 countries I can think of off the top of my head belong to at least 3 or 4 RECs. So that means that in terms of tariff bindings, import and export duties, it's incredibly difficult to then assess on which terms they are actually trading. So those sort of really, that's the stuff that people don't like to talk about when we come out of those wonderful meetings in Addis and, you know, get all excited and all Africa unite. It's very important rhetoric, but it's rhetoric nonetheless because there's really hard work around that. So those benefits are not going to really flow because the existing contradictions and the existing economic infrastructure really hasn't been dealt with. Also bearing in mind that a lot of countries are hampered and subject to the World Trade Organization rules, which are very restrictive already. And they've got particular, particular issues around most favored nation treatment, NTBs, and so on and so forth. So if we then compound the existing complexities within the regional economic communities with that massive overriding body, although it is becoming more and more peripheral, in my opinion, and the unwillingness for many governments and lawmakers, legislators, our own national, thinkers, policymakers, and think tanks to do that kind of really involved work, it does become a bit difficult then to then say that this is really beneficial to all. And, the kind of these grand research papers, which are quite problematic.
Catherine, I see that the wheels are turning there in your mind, and I'm wondering which aspects you agree with, which do you want to add to?
I very much agree that we're entering quite a complex stage of African integration, because what initially was hoped with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is that it would in fact be a way to unravel some of the knots of the multiple memberships of the existing regional economic communities. But what we're seeing in the end is that we're putting another layer on the top of the existing, it's been called the spaghetti bowl, it's been called various other things. And so we're in fact adding another layer of complexity, in fact. And so what you're going to have is traders are going to be confused in the first instance, in my mind. If I think about this in practical terms, and I'm a exporting firm in Zambia, perhaps, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about this Continental Free Trade Agreement coming into place. To me, it's just adding a whole nother layer of options and things I perhaps need to understand, different rules, whereas I've already got SADC rules. If I want to trade with some countries, I've got COMESA rules. If I want to trade with somewhere else, now I'm going to have another third set of rules that I need to understand.
So if the AU recognizes 8 of those RECs, for instance, isn't there an opportunity then for simplification of rules, so of streamlining the idea, the thoughts behind free trade?
So the whole idea around, so the AfCFTA comes from what it used to be the TFTA. I think when I first started writing about it, feels like a million years ago. And then it became the CFTA. It's been an aggregated gradualist approach. So the whole idea was to link up a few of the recs at a time, and then eventually they would all somehow come together and metamorphose into a single coherent unit.
But then, as you mentioned, we've seen overlapping of memberships in some
The
of those
overlapping national sovereignty, overriding, economic imperatives, a lack of harmonization on basic, how do we do this? Does a bag of rice in Botswana, do we measure it the same way as we would weigh the same bag of rice in Kenya, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Algeria?
So
those
just
basic...
on that, why do we have different rules of origin, for instance, of a single product and how it trades then from country to country?
Rules of origin are critical, and in fact, rules of origin and non-tariff barriers are probably the two biggest trade issues in the world right now. Rules of origin are about how you decide where a product comes from, and they're critical because when you have all these various agreements in place with different trading partners, you may have preferential treatment for a product if it's determined to come from one place versus another. So if my scarf has decided to come from Egypt perhaps, then it could enter South Africa on preferential terms than if it was considered to be made in India. And so the rules of origin are very, very important these days, especially as we've seen a lot of manufactured production move into complex global supply chains, where you don't have production taking place in just one place. It's all divided up into many different units around the world. And so this has become a tool for protectionism, definitely. An important tool in many ways also to try and deal with illegal trade or the trade of falsified products, illicit goods, and it's also linked in other ways to the complex issues around transfer pricing and tax manipulation by a lot of multinational corporations. So it's got a whole lot of various strands to it, and the negotiations are bogged down on rules of origin in many areas of trade issues, both in the African continent, but it was a sticking point, for example, in the US.
So let's take a quick break, and I wanted to pursue that discussion, especially alongside the issue of nationalism, which you mentioned, Lebohang, and what that means for future agreements on this. So don't go away. We're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area here on African Perspective. We'll be right back in just a moment.